That's Karen screaming at the city workers as they jackhammer her brand new BMW off the train track. Yep, that's my crossing. And this is what happens when the HOA blocks the only access point to your private rail spur and forgets who actually owns the land under it. Buckle up, viewer. Instantly wonders, wait, what? How do you even pull that off legally? And how does she not notice? Let me rewind, because trust me, you're going to need context to fully appreciate the symphony of pettiness and paperwork that brought us to that moment. I live in a semi-rural development about 30 minutes outside the city. I bought the land over a decade ago, and it came with something unusual, a functioning private rail spur that connects to a local industrial line. Now, to most people, that would be nothing more than an odd curiosity. But to me, it was a dream. My dad and I were obsessed with trains, vintage locomotives, diesel engines, you name it. When he passed, I inherited both our antique rail cars and our strange but beautiful hobby. I even had a custom-built barn on the edge of my property to store them and occasionally run short hauls for fun or restoration work. The key access to all this was a single paved crossing, about 40 feet wide, with warning signs and everything, that connected my property to the main rail line. That crossing was technically mine, grandfathered in and recognized by the local transportation authority. It had been there since the 1940s. Nobody cared until Karen showed up. Karen Brindley, recently divorced, professionally miserable, spiritually bitter. She bought a house in our quiet neighborhood and immediately began organizing neighborhood cleanups, trash days, petitions for sidewalks. You'd think she was running for mayor of a town that didn't exist. And then, somehow, she pulled off the unthinkable. She formed a homeowners association. You know the type rules about grass height, seasonal decorations, what color mulch you can use. And because most of the neighbors were too lazy or too polite to say no, the HOA was born, with Karen as self-appointed president. For a while, it was mostly harmless passive-aggressive newsletters, an obsession with mailboxes. But then she decided that my rail spur was an eyesore and a safety concern for children. She claimed the crossing, which again, I own, was part of shared community space now that the HOA had been ratified. I laughed at first. I actually thought it was a joke. I even showed her the land deed, the crossing permit, and the official documentation proving I own that spur and the land beneath it. Karen squinted at it, said it looked outdated, and waved it off like I'd handed her a grocery list. The next week, she had the gall to put up orange construction barriers across the entrance to the spur on my property. She stapled a laminated HOA violation notice to my gate, stating I had 7 days to cease all industrial activities. Her exact words when I confronted her. You can't just have trains where people live. This is a community, not a scrapyard. She actually tried to fine me for using my own land. I told her flat out she was trespassing. Her response? We'll see what the board says. That board, by the way, consisted of 3 people: Karen, her new best friend Deborah, who's never smiled once in her entire life, and a guy named Scott, who just joined because he thought there would be snacks. None of them knew the first thing about land use law, but that didn't stop them from dreaming big. At the next HOA meeting, which I wasn't invited to, they unveiled their plan to beautify the area by turning the crossing into a community garden and playground. They even handed out flyers showing a child's swing set sitting directly on top of the track. One neighbor, bless him, asked if that was safe. Karen said the tracks were symbolic and that the owner hadn't used them in years. Spoiler alert, I used them 2 weeks before that meeting. You'd think the city would step in. You'd be wrong. Because the HOA technically wasn't removing infrastructure, they were just enhancing shared visual space. They were allowed to install temporary landscaping over what they called non-essential easement areas. Karen called it reclaiming the landscape. I called it what it is, a hostile land grab dressed up in pastel garden gloves. They dumped gravel, laid fake turf, planted 2 crepe myrtles right on the rail line, and installed a little wooden bench. The thing is, I didn't fight them. Not immediately. I let them get comfortable. I wanted them to feel like they'd won, like they'd finally erased the thing that didn't fit their cookie-cutter dream of the neighborhood. Because here's the part they didn't know: the paperwork they dismissed as outdated had been refiled and updated 5 years ago when I renovated the rail barn. I had full title, maintenance rights, and a legally binding easement with the railway company itself. The crossing wasn't just a nostalgic oddity, it was a recognized private industrial asset. Meaning if anyone obstructed it, I could file for removal. And if they refused, I could sue. Or better yet, I could enforce. I started making some calls. I requested a full land survey. I contacted the Transportation Board. I pulled permits that hadn't been used in a decade. Quietly, slowly, I laid the groundwork for something beautiful. But I'll admit, it wasn't just about the legal win. It was personal now. Karen wasn't just rude, she was smug, condescending. She once referred to my father's vintage caboose as old junk cluttering up the view. She used her authority to bully, intimidate, and paint herself as the hero of a story nobody asked her to tell. And worst of all, she genuinely believed she was untouchable. Then one day, I got a letter in the mail from the HOA. It was an official notice informing me that, due to continued non-compliance, the board had voted to have the derelict industrial zone removed by hired contractors in 30 days. They planned to tear up the rail spur on my land using HOA funds. That's when I knew it was time to act. Because what Karen didn't realize, what she never even thought to check, was that she had just crossed from annoying to illegal. And the best part? She'd also just triggered a clause buried deep in the documentation for the original crossing agreement, a clause that, when activated, gave me more than legal control. It gave me ownership. Permanent, indisputable, untouchable ownership. So yeah, when she drove her brand new BMW onto the tracks that morning, thinking the garden was still just a garden and the train spur was still just decorative, she had no idea that she had parked on ground that no longer belonged to the HOA. No idea that the city crew she screamed at had been sent by me. No clue what she had just ignited. But what she did next, after the screaming, after the towing, after the crew walked off and left her in shock, that was the twist even I didn't expect. Because when I opened my mailbox later that day, there was another letter. One not from Karen. From the HOA board. And this one changed everything. The letter wasn't from Karen this time. It was from the HOA board. And for a second, I actually thought they were trying to apologize. The envelope was formal, thicker than usual, printed with the HOA's official crest like it was a royal decree. Inside was a typed notice, signed by Deborah and Scott, Karen's trusty little lieutenants, declaring that they had voted unanimously to reaffirm enforcement of all community improvement plans, including the permanent removal of the rail spur and closure of the adjacent crossing. They'd even attached a proposed work schedule from a landscaping company, complete with itemized costs, and a handwritten note that said, "Community beautification begins June 1st. Thank you for your cooperation." I stared at it for a long time, then laughed. Not the kind of laugh you let out when something's funny, the kind that bubbles up from a mix of disbelief and the quiet thrill of knowing someone just stepped onto a trap they didn't even see. At this point, I had stopped responding to Karen altogether. I knew better than to argue with someone who thought paperwork could be overruled by loud opinions. But the board sending this letter without even acknowledging my prior warnings? That was gold. Because now it was in writing, they were moving forward with demolition of something they didn't own. I filed the letter away and made a phone call. The woman on the other end, Brenda, worked for the rail company's regional land use office. I'd spoken with her before when I first bought the property, and again a few weeks ago to confirm the deed rights. This time, I asked the question I'd been waiting to ask. What would it take to purchase full title of the crossing outright? Not just usage rights, not just easements, the land itself. Turns out, it wasn't that complicated. The company had no long-term plans for the line, and since I'd already been maintaining that section for over a decade, they were happy to offload the liability. Within 2 weeks, I had a signed agreement. I officially became the sole owner of the rail crossing and surrounding access zone. The HOA couldn't touch it now. And even the city had to acknowledge my property lines. I had my lawyer update the records and file a public notice of private access restrictions. It wasn't even dramatic, it was a few lines in a county filing system that nobody reads until it's too late. Then came the fun part. I filed for temporary closure of the crossing due to safety violations, specifically, the presence of unpermitted structures like garden fencing, cement pavers, and decorative shrubbery installed by the HOA. The city approved it in a heartbeat. All I had to do was show the survey and highlight the blocked track. Suddenly, those little lawn gnomes and hanging flower pots were considered obstructions on a designated private access point. I posted notice at the site. Work crews would arrive to clear the area and restore proper access to the rail spur. Karen must have seen it, because not a day later, I caught her pacing around the garden with her phone out, recording videos and narrating like she was uncovering some great injustice. She actually uploaded one to the HOA's community Facebook page. It showed her standing beside a patch of roses and pointing at the sign that said, "Private access, work crews scheduled." In the video, she claimed I was dismantling a cherished public space and using outdated industrial law to bully the neighborhood. Comments were split between confused residents and the usual cheerleaders saying things like, "We stand with Karen," and "Save the Greenway." I didn't reply. I let her dig deeper. Meanwhile, I wasn't just clearing the track. I was laying groundwork for a bigger play. See, while going through my documents, I discovered something almost too perfect. A forgotten easement that ran behind the HOA's new walking trail. It connected to a strip of land they'd converted into a tiny community park, complete with benches, a dog waste station, and a sad little wooden gazebo. According to the original property maps, that strip crossed over a sliver of land I technically still owned from a decades-old parcel merger that had never been properly updated. It was a narrow wedge, maybe 10 feet wide, but just enough to count. And now, with the HOA using it for public gatherings and access, that meant they were infringing on my property again. Only this time, I could do more than file complaints. I submitted a notice of encroachment to the HOA's legal inbox and followed it with a cease and desist for all non-permitted public use. If they wanted to keep using the area, they'd need to formally lease it from me. Of course, I knew they'd never agree to that. Karen would rather set the park on fire than admit they'd made a mistake. But by putting it in legal terms, I forced their hand. They had to respond. Deborah emailed me a week later. She sounded nervous, as if realizing for the first time that I wasn't bluffing. She asked for clarification on the easement and whether friendly negotiation was still possible. I told her politely that all offers would need to go through my attorney from now on. Karen, of course, wasn't having any of it. She called an emergency HOA meeting, declared my documents fraudulent, and accused me of deliberate obstruction of community resources. I heard about it from a neighbor who sat in the back row just for the free donut. Apparently, Karen gave a whole speech about protecting the soul of the neighborhood while waving around a binder filled with printed Google Maps screenshots. She even suggested I was running an unauthorized industrial operation and that the HOA would take action if the city refused to. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that the city had already been briefed. The moment she laid garden fencing over a designated rail access, they stopped taking her complaints seriously. And when she tried to escalate her grievance to the municipal zoning board, the rep she spoke to was the same woman who'd signed off on my closure permit. She tried to bluff her way through the call, insisting the HOA had jurisdiction. The official reportedly told her, "Ma'am, you're trying to tell me you outrank the railroad?" It was around this time that something strange happened. People in the neighborhood started talking to me again. At first, it was just nods, awkward hellos. Then one guy stopped by while I was out trimming the hedge. He said, "Look, I didn't know what Karen was doing. I just signed what they handed me. If I'd known you owned all that, I wouldn't have agreed to any of it." I didn't hold it against him. Karen's power came from making people believe they had no choice. But now that she was losing ground, literally, they were starting to see the cracks. Still, Karen wasn't done. Not even close. Because 2 days after the work crew arrived to begin clearing the track, I noticed something out of place, a handwritten sign stuck to one of the barricades. It read, "Unauthorized work. This area is under HOA investigation. Cease immediately." She'd signed it herself in marker, as if her signature could override property law. But the best part wasn't the sign. It was what I found behind it, an invoice. A full, official invoice from a private contractor addressed to the HOA for the removal of the rail spur, scheduled for the following Monday. She was still trying to have it torn out, and this time, she was paying for it with HOA funds. The invoice was the final straw. Not because she tried to have the rail spur removed again, but because she was now spending HOA funds to do it real money from real people on something that was not only illegal but catastrophically stupid. I could already imagine the fallout. Picture a board meeting where residents discover their dues were being used to rip up a historically documented rail line owned by a neighbor who had legal title, permits, and about 15 different ways to countersue. But instead of confronting her immediately, I kept quiet. I wanted her to feel absolutely certain she was winning. Because what Karen had failed to realize, time and time again, was that the law isn't just paperwork, it's timing. And hers was about to run out. While she prepared her demolition fantasy, I finalized my ownership paperwork with the rail company. We weren't just talking about the spur now, I bought the crossing outright. The gravel, the lines, the access strip, all of it. And because the crossing had previously been registered as a commercial access point, I was able to re-register it with a formal closure notice. In practical terms, it meant I could shut it down and restrict all entry without needing a single signature from anyone in the HOA. I submitted the updated plans to the city's planning department under safety compliance and private asset restoration. They approved it within 3 days. That's the thing about doing things by the book, it takes longer, but when it lands hard. Then came the signage. Professionally printed, weatherproofed, mounted with bolts that would outlast a hurricane. They read, "Private railroad crossing. No public access. Authorized entry only." I also had gates installed, steel ones, with electronic locks that connected to my phone. On the day of installation, a few curious neighbors wandered by. I didn't say much, just smiled and waved. I wanted word to spread slowly, organically, like the realization that your Queen Bee HOA president might have been bluffing this entire time. By the weekend, the HOA newsletter arrived with a small blurb at the bottom: community greenway construction temporarily paused due to logistics. Logistics. That was Karen speak for, we got caught with our hand in the legal cookie jar. I'd like to think that was the beginning of her unraveling. But Karen wasn't the unraveling type. She was the digging deeper type. So she did what she always did, she doubled down. She called it community walk and talk and invited the neighborhood to stroll the garden space while sharing ideas for future upgrades. It was a total PR move, designed to distract from the fact that her construction had been halted, her invoices were under scrutiny, and her golden playground plan had turned into a financial sinkhole. I decided to attend just as a civilian. You know, casual clothes, sunglasses, coffee cup. As she led a group of about 15 residents around the turf-covered tracks, I stood near the gate and watched. When she got close, she locked eyes with me, and I swear, if looks could file restraining orders, I'd have been served right then. She pretended not to see the gate, not to see the signs, not to acknowledge the massive, obvious shift in who owned what. But the rest of the crowd saw it. And a few of them started asking questions. Why was the gate locked? Who put up those signs? What's going on with the crossing? Karen pivoted like a politician mid-scandal. She said it was a temporary measure due to undocumented infrastructure complications and claimed she was working closely with the property owner to resolve it. I nearly choked on my coffee. That was the first time she'd ever publicly acknowledged that I owned the land. A small win, but a satisfying one. One neighbor, a guy named Mitch, asked if the HOA was still planning to remove the tracks. Karen stuttered for the first time in months. Said, "We're evaluating all options." Translation, she had no idea what to do next. But she wasn't out of tricks just yet.